Hello everyone. So this week we are going to talk about Xenophanes of Colophon, who was a very, very interesting figure in the history of philosophy. Actually, there's some controversy about him being a philosopher at all, though, in this week we'll discuss why he very definitively qualifies as one of the initial philosophers that we have. But there is some controversy because apart from being a philosopher, he was a poet, a rhapsode, what is called a rhapsode, who were people who were bards of sorts, who would go around and recite Homer, sing sort of parts of Homer. So they were these Homeric bards. So he was a bard, except he was not quite a Homeric rhapsode. You will notice, he is very, very critical of Homer. He was a satirist. He wrote these things called Silloi. And he was general polymath, right? He even came up with a bit of a cosmology, although, it's a bit of a cosmology, really. And not very clear whether the cosmology is a positive cosmology or is it more of a critique of, pre-philosophical cosmologies of Homer and Hesiod. But he did come up with one. And he was this amazing long-lived person. So he lived for, well, by some accounts, for nearly 100 years. There is one fragment where he says that, he is 92 and still writing. So he at least lived for 92 years. And so his, the dates of birth and death are given as being from around 570 BC to 470 BC, which means that he was sort of contemporary with the earliest pre-Socratics and the later ones as well, right? So like a huge span of life. And his Florowith is counted as somewhere around 540 BC. And he was born, as I said, in Colophon, which is again in Ionia, Anatolia, Turkey, sort of the coast of Turkey. But later there were political problems there, and then he lived sort of in Sicily. So he moved towards Italy, towards Magna Graecia. And he is supposed to have traveled widely. He himself says that. And you will see in his philosophy, the effects of this wide traveling. And he is the first Greek philosopher from whom we have a significant amount of fragments. We have about 40 fragments, and that they constitute around 118 lines. So there's a lot of fragments, and he writes also, and he wrote in verse form. So the advantage, as we've talked about when we talked about sources and methods, the advantage with verse form is that it gives us some confidence about the authenticity. I mean, of course, it doesn't give absolute confidence in the sense that somebody else might have composed, later and put it in, but people don't tend to do that often. It's too much work, right? So it gives us some confidence about authenticity. And more importantly, when doxographers are quoting him later on, it helps us make a distinction between which part is the quote and which part is a paraphrase, right? Just think about it, if somebody writes in prose and writes in the same dialect, then it's very difficult if you don't have the quotation marks. You don't have a system of quotation marks, which they didn't earlier, to distinguish, which part, let's say, is Aristotle and which part is Heraclitus. I mean, there are two ways of distinguishing. One is a change of dialect. So, if there is a change of dialect from, one form of Greek to another form of Greek, then you know that, okay, this part is probably a quote. And the other one, very sort of like one that gives confidence is when it comes to verse, when, as soon as you see that it goes into meter, it breaks into verse form, it is probably a quote, right? Because if the text is in prose, then why should it break into verse halfway through, right? He wrote, so this is one of the testimonia, he wrote in epic meter, he wrote elegaics and iambics, and the elegaics and iambics were basically used as a kind of, let's say critique, right? It was to make fun of other people. And epic meter was to sort of, announce new things, the more sort of, a more elevated kind of meter. Also used by Homer, so there would be a critical element that would enter here as well. And he used to recite his own original poems. So, as I said, when we say that he was a rhapsode, he was not simply, reciting Homer going around reciting Homer or other poets. He used to recite his own poems. So that means he composed his own poems, recited his own poems, and these poems, we will see, were sometimes highly critical of the traditional sort of greats of the culture. Plato and Aristotle, said that he was a founder of the Eleatic school, which we'll look at later, and he was a teacher of Parmenides, which both these claims are disputed. He might have traveled to Elia because he was on, as I said, he went to Sicily, so he was on that landmass, that side. But, and then some of his ideas do sound proto-Eleatic, as you will notice, but, this is definitely very, very disputed, so probably not true. We do have testimonia that he came up, he made a detailed cosmology and probably a cosmogony, like the Milesians, and that he might have written this, the book that is attributed to everybody, which is Peripusios on nature. So he might have written that, but it's doubtful. We don't have anything of it. Yeah, and most extant fragments that we do have from him are often literary rather than philosophical, but we do have teasing hints of a cosmology, as you would see. These teasing hints give us an idea that there might have been a fair number of scientific and philosophical verses which sort of belie this kind of a systematic engagement with cosmological, scientific, philosophical questions. What he did, what we do have, and what we can definitely sort of speak a bit more about, is that he did a theological critique. And not just a theological critique, he did a theological critique, which is very interesting. He also offered some constructive theology. So, that's, I think, one of his biggest contributions, fairly big contribution. We do have, as I said, some fragments of nature. So there is some sort of, hint of a natural philosophy. So we'll talk about that as well. And the other very important thing that we have from him is kind of epistemology, a theory of human knowledge. There are fragments who talk about human knowledge, the capacity for human knowledge. So we have that as well. But before we go, so in the next video, I'll talk about his theological critique, and the one after, I'll talk about natural philosophy, and the last one about epistemology. But before we do all that, I'd like to quote from this, what is called Fragment 1. It's a pretty big fragment, and I'll quote one of the translations out here. You can find this in Guthrie, of Fragment 1. Where you will get an idea of the kind of things that he would have recited when he recited his own poems. So this is a fragment in which he is probably in a drinking party, and he is he's this kind of a traveler who is at somebody's house, and there he's asked, okay, can you recite a poem? Can you sing us a song? And as a rhapsode, he recites this poem, which you will see that this brings in little elements of his philosophy, of his critique, even this fragment, right? So now the floor swept, hands and cups washed clean, fresh woven garlands crown our heads, and now the fragrant unguent bottle makes its rounds. The bowl stands waiting, brimful of good cheer, and here's another wine that will not fail, soft tasting, flower scented in its jars. Incense distills the scent of holiness, and there is water, cold and sweet and clean. See the brown loaves, and on a worthy table a load of cheeses and rich honey lies. As centerpiece, an altar, thickly strewn with flowers. Song and revel fill the hall. First, it is meet for righteous men to hymn, with pious stories and pure words, the God. Notice the singular. Then, due libations paid, with prayers for strength to act aright, our plainest duty this. It is no sin to drink, so much that all not weak from age may come safe home alone. Praise him who after drinking can relate fine deeds, as memory serves and lust for good. Give us no fights with titans, no, nor giants, nor centaurs, which our fathers falsely told, nor civil brawls in which no profit is, but to be mindful of the gods is good. Yeah, so you can see this very, very cheerful fragment, description of this this beautiful dinner party where it's full of fresh woven garlands that that people are wearing. There are washed cups. There are perfumes and fresh water, wine in these flower scented jars. Really pretty description. And incense, and then some advice that drink, but not so much that you will. It's not so much that you cannot walk home. That only the old need help to walk home. And that's why we have this fragment, because somebody quoted it in a medical treatise about drinking, but not to excess. So yes, there's nothing wrong with some wine, but in moderation. Yeah, and then there is bread and cheese and honey, and then some description of custom. First it is meet, it is right to to hymn and to praise the god, right? To start with these libations, due libations and prayers, and then to talk, to tell stories, but right, do not tell stories of Titans or of giants or of centaurs, which are fathers, which are sort of ancestors, told as fictions, as like falsities. Our fathers falsely told, So again, Homer, Hesiod. This is not typical, Homer and Hesiod this was the ancestry of the world. We have talked about it. In popular imagination, this was the ancestry of the world. So to say, our fathers falsely talked about, all those sort of titans and giants and all these things. So, and not even talk about civil brawls or brawls of any sort. I think the other translation would be violent conflicts. I'll have to look up the Greek. Where there's no profit, But, last sentence, to be mindful of the gods is good. He's still giving this thing of like, be mindful of the gods. And we'll see this is pretty tricky, this line, because he'll talk about, non-plurality of gods, but we'll get there. And this sort of very cheerful description of a party, of a drinking party, sort of gives you an idea of the kind of thing that Xenophanes did in his very, very long life, as we already talked about. If he was still sort of doing this writing and singing at the age of 92, so in his very long life, he would travel around, go to different houses. He was invited in these aristocratic circles to be part of dinner parties and, to sing, to entertain. So fragment 22, which is also quoted here. This is the way to speak around the fire in winter, on a soft couch, belly full, drinking sweet wine and crunching hazelnuts. This is a quote. Now tell us, sir, your name and home and age. How old were you the year that Medea appeared? This is almost like a, he himself, in this case, becomes a character like Odysseus, traveling, coming to new houses, as a guest, and then they ask him, okay, where did you come from? So they first give him, all the hospitality. So he has, food and wine and hazelnuts, all these things. And then they ask him, okay, where did you come from? Tell us stories. And what kind of stories does he tell? He tells nice stories, but not about centaurs and giants and violent conflicts. There's this idea of a traveling poet, that's the kind of image that we have of Xenophanes as this traveling poet who sort of, goes to different households and, sings, entertains, enjoys a high life with, good food and hazelnuts and wine and incense and, fresh garlands and all kinds of things. And at the same time, talks about what is right to do, right customs for the gods. So we have this lovely image, and then when we start looking at the rest of the fragments, we'll see that he is a very, very sharp and incisive critic, a very, very sharp and incisive critic, where he criticizes, a lot of these traditional customs, a lot of these traditional gods. So in our next video, we'll talk about his theology in detail, but just to sort of start the mention of it, apart from this, very, very nice fragment, I really like this one, his extant fragments, we find, incisive theological critique, incisive epistemological critique. He critiques, his critique of human knowledge is also very, very incisive, and some, natural philosophy, which the philosophers at that time tended to do. So, as I said, not an uncontroversial figure, complex figure, a poet, but also a philosopher. And that's why, he could be included in an anthology on sort of Greek poetry of that time, but also counted amongst the great Greek philosophers, the original Greek philosophers. So next time we'll talk about his theology. Thank you.